case, and then 2 contentions. Is everybody ready? Great. My time will begin 3, 2, 1. Proud to affirm Mexico should resume its oil sales to Cuba. So to give you some background to what's actually happening right now, in early February, there was Mexico is basically like, first of all, Mexico is a huge shipper of oil to Cuba. Cuba relies on Mexico. 44% of its oil all comes from Cuba. In early February, President Donald Trump basically said, okay, if anybody starts shipping oil to Cuba, we're going to tariff them because we don't like Cuba because they're communists. So there's basically an ideological gap and like a historical gap with the current administration's like opposition to Cuba, and basically there's been threatened tariffs to countries that then end up like doing stuff like basically like shipping oil to Cuba. So what happened after that actually is that the Supreme Court basically made his decision using the IEEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the way he actually tariffed Cuba. The Supreme Court ruled this illegal. So first of all, Trump can actually not use that, invoke that to tariff these countries anymore, so Mexico doesn't face a risk of tariffs. And the second risk of tariff would come from Section 122 of the Global Powers Act, in which basically Trump could say, okay, I have like a capability to intervene, and right now this is being challenged in court. This is the tariff that is currently at risk for Mexico and is currently in court. Here's why it's actually going to be ruled illegal as well. In that clause, it states that you must require a fundamental international payment problem, like currency collapse, to actually trigger fundamental usage of this policy and of this tariff policy for the president to actually justify his usage and to make it into other countries. We see that this is definitely not a fundamental currency collapse with Mexico shipping oil to Cuba, which means that you're never going to get any justification for this tariff being legal, which means that there's no risk of tariff. Let's just establish that in the background. Okay, on the framework here, we also say that the resolution is saying Mexico should resume its oil to Cuba, and it's not framing that Mexico as this house. So we're saying we're evaluating this as net benefits for everybody within the world. Like objectively, should Mexico do this or not? If we prove that there's more good than bad to actually do it, then that's what you're going to evaluate this round on. The plain text here is that again, Mexico should resume its oil to Cuba. The actor is going to be the federal government of Mexico. Time frame is starting tomorrow. Funding normal ways and means. Everything goes through that pathway. Okay. First contention is on the electrical grid. The uniquest one is that currently Cuba is incredibly energy reliant on oil. 44%. First, the A is that 44% of its oil comes from Mexico, and B is that 88% of energy is oil-based. So Mexico basically supplies a huge portion of the energy that actually powers the electrical grid. The second uniqueness here is that cuts to oil supply have happened multiple times and created 3 nationwide power shutdowns consecutively because there's a lack of access to oil that's coming from Mexico. The A here is that when you have shutdowns, there's literally no power, which is first of all restricted access to power for 10 million people. What this does is a couple things. First, it literally their water and all their systems that give them power and basic means to live and quality of life is completely shut down, so they have no access to a lot of stuff that can help them cook food, that can access things. And the B is that it basically cuts away all power to hospitals, and there's 100,000 people in current need of urgent surgical care that would keep them alive or else they're gonna die. And without power, this doesn't happen. So what happens with the shutdown? First of all, you risk basically the whole island, 10 million people aren't gonna have, yes?
Do you see it as an impossibility for Cuba to ever in the future be able to switch to a different source of energy?
We think that they're never going to be able to switch to different sources of energy if they maintain this type of blackout situation. In the SQO, they have literally no other research or other pathway, especially because they're so globally restricted at the time. So no, you're not going to see an alternative, especially right now as when we're enacting the plan. So those are what you're seeing from here. The uniqueness theory that 90% of Cuba is in extreme poverty because they have literally no pathways out except for maintaining their power, and they have no resources to start innovating or whatever to create other situations because they're so susceptible to this poverty and blackouts in the status quo. When you see these blackouts coming in, you're not going to see any possibility of solvency or redirection into any pathway. Okay, the link one is that what you do by resuming oil sales, it means that they get their power back. It means Cuba can start getting oil again. It means they can start powering the electrical grid, and you basically get these 10 million people have way better quality of life, access to sustainable means of living, and those 100,000 people that are in need of surgery can probably get the surgery, which means that they probably live. This is unique to the world. The subpoint B is on American imperialism. Uniqueness one is that Trump says that he's going to use if they keep a power outage, he's gonna probably take over Cuba if they maintain a blackout. He wants to do this because he hates Cuba because there's a couple points here, and U2 is on opposite. There's always this historical opposition between Cuba and the U.S. The A is that there's the historical rhetoric because Cuba was once communist, especially during the Cold War. There's always this tension, especially with the current administration being inherently all anti-communist. And the B is that there's also just there's a complete there's a distaste and dissent against the Cuban people, and the current administration believes they're lesser and thinks that they should be under the wing of American imperialism. Uniqueness 3 is that the other parallel we draw is Puerto Rico, in which after America took over Puerto Rico, they literally did forced sterilization of women. So like basically everybody within like these countries that end up becoming territories or taken over by the U.S. become dehumanized. So the link is that this U.S. takeover creates like first of all like a systemic repression of people and dehumanization to everybody underneath, because they're always like fundamentally under a system that's always like meant to drive them out and meant to oppress them. So they basically never have like any fundamental like living, no value to life essentially, because they're always like in a system that's trying to keep them like giving them the worst conditions possible. And they also have like no autonomy or voting power. Like look to Puerto Rico as well. Like they're literally not considered. Their vote is basically not considered whatsoever under their governance. C2 is on the Mexican economy. The uniqueness one is that like the oil company supplying. The oil company is called Pemex, which is state-owned, that's actually supplying oil to Cuba, is basically like 30%, holds about 30% of federal revenue. The uniqueness two is they also contribute to 10% of Mexicans' like countrywide GDP. The uniqueness three is that like Pemex currently employs 130,000 employees. So basically that's a ton of jobs in Mexico, and we see that like they're already facing risks of having to like fire about 3,000 people, like independent of the possible like flooding revenue shortages that are coming from not being able to get money back. Yes.
On the point of economy, for Cuban economy specifically, do you think Cuba would be able to purchase like humanitarian aid, for example?
First of all, actually, Cuba isn't purchasing humanitarian aid. Mexico is actually supplying humanitarian aid alongside it. This is actually really good for us because a lot of the revenue that they're getting from their oil sales and generally goes towards the humanitarian aid that they're paying towards Cuba, which means that they won't be able to sustain humanitarian aid that they are providing to Cuba in the status quo if they don't have any of this revenue coming in from the oil. So we think that like oil is actually key to humanitarian aid because it gives them the resources to going to access to give these to Cuba from Mexico. Okay, back to the second contention. We tell you first of all, the link is that this is a sustained revenue loss, like over like 4% of all this company's revenue comes from Cuba, which is substantial, especially considering the like massive impact that the company has on the economy. The impacts that you have here is that they're immediately going to fire over like 3,000 workers for sure. Those people will be like on the streets, they'll be unhoused, they'll be at higher risk of STIs, they won't have like a label, they'll be dehumanized and systemically repressed. And B is that you'll probably have like a bit of like an economic recession that probably impacts like wages for everybody across the country, which means that everybody's quality of life probably decreases too.
Okay.
And in our case,
Yeah, I got it. Good.
and then I'll write down.
Yeah. Okay. Is everyone ready? All right, then I will start my time on my first written. 3, 2, 1. Hello, judges. My name is Derek Shaw. I'm here today on the opposition side of the motion. Mexico should resume its oil sales to Cuba, representing the King's School. Now, before I get into my case, I'd like to just start with some top of case stuff, okay? So they give you all this background as to how, like, these tariffs are, like, not going to pass. Trump will never be able to pass tariffs because the Supreme Court has said no, they're not legal, whatever. Okay, we agree that maybe the first set of tariffs were illegal, but that doesn't mean that Trump won't continue to threaten tariffs. And as long as tariffs are being threatened, and as long as there's a possibility that the tariffs could pass, there will be uncertainty, and that uncertainty is really what causes the fundamental damage to the economy. It's the perception that there may be tariffs, not necessarily that the tariffs actually get passed. Even if the tariffs never actually get passed, as long as Trump continues to threaten, and as long as the world economy knows that Trump has passed tariffs in the past, that Trump does constantly violate what people tell him he can't do, even the Supreme Court in some instances, then it means that there will be uncertainty as to whether or not the tariffs actually get passed, and that is what fundamentally will be hurting the Mexican economy. But as I'll get into later in my case, there are other alternatives besides just tariffs that Trump can use to hurt the Mexican economy. But just know that it's also perception that can in some instances POO. Not right now. Not just know that it's perception in some instances that can also be reality, not just what Trump is told he can't do, okay? And then now to get into my first contention. My first contention is U.S. intervention in Mexico. Judge, the situation in Cuba is not good right now. And why? It's because of Trump and because of his pressure campaign against Cuba. We both agree on that. Trump is volatile, he's hostile, he's aggressive, he acts on whims, and his actions have devastating consequences. Already, Trump has begun to threaten Mexico, and indeed every country that attempts to provide Cuba with oil and circumvent his embargo. These threats have come in multiple forms. First are economic threats and sanctions, which would be incredibly devastating to Mexico's economy, which we would argue that the government should not want, given that their entire second engine is about how we should benefit the Mexican economy, okay? Trump has threatened massive sanctions against Pemex, the Mexican state-owned oil company. And these are not tariffs. He can sanction these companies as he wishes, okay? This is the largest Mexican enterprise, as my opponents have mentioned. It employs many thousands of people, and it provides a massive amount of the Mexican GDP and economy. POI? Not right now. It's tens of billions of dollars in revenue, it's almost $100 billion in revenue for the Mexican economy and tens of billions of dollars in profits for the Mexican economy, all of which, because it's a Mexican state-owned company, goes back to the Mexican people. In short, it's very critical, and that's before you consider the jobs and everything. Both sides agree that it's very important that we protect Pemex, okay? So Trump is threatening sanctions, which he can do against Pemex, and Mexico can't afford to lose this critical revenue. Additionally, Trump has promised massive sanctions against Mexico in general, and tariffs as well, should Mexico try to continue to send oil to Cuba, okay? Even if these tariffs never actually pass, he can't pass sanctions, and even if the tariffs don't pass, it creates a perception of risk for foreign investment, which is what like so much of Latin America, including Mexico, depends on, which is why fundamentally Mexico cannot risk this. Mexico's economy is growing, but slowly. It needs revenues from its exports to the USA, and tariffs and import taxes would hurt a lot. Plus, in addition, Trump threatened to remove the free trade deal from Mexico if they give Cubans oil. That would simply be disastrous for Mexico, and that's independent of any tariffs happening, okay? So the Mexican economy will be very harshly damaged should they attempt to continue to provide Cuba with oil. Second way that Trump can intervene in Mexico is through the military. So what other nation provided Cuban oil? It was Venezuela. Trump interdicted their tankers using military force. He targeted Venezuelan ships and ships of allied nations of Venezuela. He even captured the Venezuelan leader, who's still sitting on trial and has not been charged with anything yet. So you might say, wouldn't do to Mexico, you might say, Trump wouldn't do that to Mexico. That's simply untrue. Trump has threatened to intervene military in Mexico in the past. In fact, after Venezuela, he literally warned that Mexico, and I quote, was next, okay? Military intervention by the U.S. would be horrible for Mexico. It would mean destroyed towns, potentially parts of cities being destroyed, such as we're seeing in Venezuela. People killed, displaced potentially. There would be economic repercussions as a result of Mexican industry being damaged. All this would be horrible, and that could come about as a result of the government plan passing. Now to get into our second intention, which is that oil sales don't fix the humanitarian crisis, and Mexico is doing alternatives. Judge, it's true that Cuba is facing a humanitarian crisis at the moment. Humanitarian crises require humanitarian aid, which is fundamentally what Mexico should be doing and what they are doing right now. In fact, this is what Mexico recently started doing, visiting, using its money, sending 814 tons of humanitarian supplies to Cuba. Compared to the recent plan of humanitarian support, sending humanitarian supplies like milk, meat, crackers, beans, and medicine like they're currently doing is much better, right, than oil sales. To see why, we have two subpoints. A is harms of oil, and B is benefits of humanitarian aid. For A, oil sales would be destructive for Cuba through the economic damage in which of buying oil and its environmental effects. I remind you, Judge, the motion states that oil sales, meaning that Cuba has to actually purchase the oil. They're not just getting it for free. This would lead to further economic damages in Cuba, with their economy already not having enough to support its citizens. Furthermore, oil refining poses significant health risks, which will cause further death and ecological destruction. These are both incredibly bad for the Cuban people and the world through reducing quality of life. And B is benefits of humanitarian aid. Judge, look at what the Cubans need. A family can't eat oil, can't drink petroleum, can't bandage a wound with oil. While yes, electricity is important, as I will get into later, there are alternatives. What Cuba does need, however, is humanitarian aid right now. On top of the obvious benefits, such as people having enough to eat, people having a place to live, that's safe and all that, not having to go cold at night, whatever. This is also will maintain Mexican-Cuban relations through showing Mexican support. Overall, humanitarian aid both directly alleviates the suffering of Cuba, maintains relations, and prevents some of the consequences of oil. Okay, now to get into the PMC rebuttal. Okay, so first contention was the electrical grid in Cuba, and they give you all this analysis about how Cuba relies on Mexican oil for their electrical grid, how this is super important, right? But and this is the basic means to life. They need this electricity. Well, first I'd argue that the basic means to life don't have to be shut down just because the electrical grid may be shut down, right? Humanitarian aid is coming from countries like Mexico, and that definitely helps alleviate a lot of the suffering, especially when you consider that Cuba is still paying for the oil. It's not like they're just getting it for free, right? So if they can invest in buying oil, they can also invest in other technologies, contrary to what the government would have you believe. Also, even countries with access to oil don't magically avoid blackouts, for example. It's a very common problem in the region. For example, countries such as Haiti and the Caribbean have access to oil imports, but still have many, many blackouts, okay? So it's not just by allowing Cuba to have oil, this will magically cure all the blackouts and all the bad things like that, okay? The government would have you believe that we're never able to switch to anything besides oil, which is simply untrue, and in the long term it may end up being better for the Cuban people, okay? But also, consider the harms that would happen to the Mexican people if Mexico were to continue selling oil to Cuba, right? There'd be massive harms to those people, as Trump would intervene in Mexico to forcibly stop them from doing this to Cuba. If you buy the government's analysis that Trump hates Cuba so much that he will do anything to force Cuba to just switch regimes or whatever, switch governments, and he will do this to Mexico in order to prevent Cuba from getting these oil supplies, which means that there will be negative harms to the Mexican people either way, okay? And then the next point on their contention too of the Mexican economy, Judge, this is completely irrelevant, okay? So yes, Pemex is already on the verge. Yes, it's very important that Pemex doesn't collapse, but it's not like Mexico can only sell oil to Cuba. There's a global oil shortage right now. Prices have never been higher. It's a great time to be an oil company, especially one that doesn't have to travel through the Strait of Hormuz to ship your oil right now, okay? That means that literally all of their impacts are completely moot and you should not vote on any of these, right? Just because Mexico is not providing oil to Cuba doesn't mean that they can't still sell their oil and they can't still get these profits and they can't still fund their company Pemex and they can't still fund these people's jobs and everything, okay? They're still going to be able to do that. They can sell that oil to the US. They can sell that oil to any one of the countries worldwide that needs oil, especially because 20% of the world's oil is shut down right now. That's simply a horrible claim from the side government to make, and you should not be voting on this, okay? So, Judge, for these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to be on side opposition. Thank you.
Alright, so the speech order is going to be a bit of just review of the framework and just an overview of the framework and then app case and then next case. My time starts.
Wait, what's the order of the cases going to be?
App case then red case.
Okay.
Yeah. Everybody ready? Yeah. Okay. Time starts. All right. Cuba is facing its worst economic crisis in 67 years. This is because of U.S. sanctions in particular, and in the world that the negation advocates, you cannot do anything as any sovereign country unless you are basically commanded by the United States. You basically have to listen to Trump and whatever he says if you want anything to happen. The negation world says that it's the perceptual link and that Trump being able to even threaten tariffs is why Mexico shouldn't do anything. But if we just don't do anything just based on the threat of Trump and the United States being able to do anything, then no country can ever do anything. You're linking directly into the US imperialism and intervention that both sides agree is really bad. Now, on to the first contention on the affirmative side, electricity. So basically, the negation says that humanitarian aid solves and that Cuba can still pay for oil, and Cuba will still be paying for oil. The issue is not that Cuba is paying for oil, the issue is that they literally cannot ship oil into Cuba unless Mexico actually starts doing these sales at all. Cuba can pay for the oil, yes, they're going to be fine if they can pay for the oil. The issue is not that they don't have the money to pay for oil, the issue is that the United States is trying to block countries from shipping oil into Cuba at all. If Mexico just starts selling oil to Cuba, then Cuba will be able to get that oil and supply electricity to all the people in the country that need it. And they say that humanitarian aid solves. Sure, that Mexico can ship meat and all these different kinds of food supplies into Cuba, but that cannot solve for the fact that electricity is needed for many basic life functions. Like if you want to be able to refrigerate food to store most food from going bad, then you need a fridge which is powered by electricity. If you want to be able to cook food, then you basically need power. So many forms of just basic necessities to live need power and oil to do that. And remember, Cuba is dependent on oil for 88% of its. Yeah.
If you say that you need power to live, can you explain how humans have survived before the Industrial Revolution?
Times have changed. Yeah, anyway, that's irrelevant. Funding from oil also directly supplies humanitarian aid. When Mexico makes profit from oil and sales to Cuba, that actually helps the government have more revenue that they can use to provide humanitarian aid into Cuba. So the link on humanitarian aid solving is actually strengthened by having more profits from oil, and it's really important that Mexico can sell oil to Cuba. It's also non-unique in both worlds. Humanitarian aid will happen in either world because Mexico will do that anyway. What we're adding is the benefits of also selling oil and shipping oil to Cuba again. They also say that Mexico will get screwed by Trump no matter what, but basically this links into the same contention we're talking about American imperialism in our subpoint B. If we basically let Trump do whatever he wants no matter what and say that if he can just intervene no matter what, then we don't do anything that he doesn't want, then this specifically leads into American imperialism. The reason that he's trying to take over Cuba is for economic benefits to the United States, and because he sees Cuba as a weak country that he can just assert force over and take over. Mexico is not seen the same way by Trump. Trump will not automatically start going against Mexico unless he sees that he can assert his power over Cuba and do things like that. Also, if you have this kind of thing happening where Trump can just threaten something and then you always have every country following along because they're afraid of what the US will do, then you're basically leading into worldwide political stasis where nothing ever happens unless the US approves, which is basically a worldwide US dictatorship. This is really bad because American imperialism has had horrible consequences for people in the past. Like when America took over Puerto Rico, there was forced sterilization and there was no autonomy for the people in Puerto Rico. When America overthrew a democratically elected government in Guatemala in the 1950s for economic benefit, many people were oppressed, and the government that the US installed tried to do a genocide against the Mayan people. US imperialism is a directly really bad thing because the US only cares about its economic benefits, especially under the current administration. The kind of regime change that Trump is trying to perform in Cuba would also be a precedent for him to continue this elsewhere if the Mexico just gives in and doesn't do anything to stop it. Giving oil shipments to Cuba directly demonstrates that there are countries that will stand up to what the US demands and will provide Cuba with aid, even if the US is trying to do this kind of takeover situation. All of the impacts they give basically on imperialism and invasion of Mexico are more likely if America has shown that they can just do whatever they want and assert any force they want to take over Cuba than if we actually do something right now as Mexico to signal to them that it is bad and that we will do some action against them. Also, on the idea that we can just switch to renewables and Cuba can just switch over and do other sources than oil, remember we are dealing with active blackouts right now. 3 times the electricity grid has collapsed. It's just not practical for Cuba to suddenly switch over to green energy and stop using oil entirely. Especially, it's like just not really possible, especially when 88% of energy is dependent on oil. If you are literally having people unable to survive because they don't have electricity, you don't have the people who can even build renewable energy and infrastructure. Right now, oil is necessary because the people of Cuba depend on that for their power and survival. Like, you cannot imagine a better future of renewable energy without at least solving the issue today where Cuba is literally at risk of collapse because they don't have power. On the second condition about the Mexican economy, they say that Mexico can still sell oil elsewhere and that Hormuz, like the shipping shutdown in the Strait of Hormuz and profitability from selling oil make it really good actually to be an oil company right now. Sure, maybe it is really good to be an oil company right now, but then that's directly goes against their own, you can cross-apply that to their own first contention on US intervention and how Pemex would be sanctioned really badly. If this is such, if it's so good to be an oil company right now, then the sanctions that the US would impose on Pemex would have basically no effect, especially considering that the US is a net exporter of oil. The US does not need oil from Pemex, and there's basically no real relation between the US and Pemex. We're not really importing anything from Pemex in the first place. Pemex would not be affected by these oil sanctions. So even if it's profitable for Pemex to be an oil company right now, it's still, like, the only real impact that happens to Pemex is the sanctions against Cuba, making it impossible for them to make that bit of profit. So the only thing, so Mexico can sell elsewhere, yes, but they will have more profit if they can sell to Cuba, and that will save those 3,000 jobs and create more profit that links into the government providing more humanitarian aid. Because Pemex is a state-owned company, that profit goes directly to the government. It's $500 million that are currently being blocked in sales to Cuba because Mexico is not just shipping and avoiding the US sanctions. On the first contention about US sanctions being really, if Trump invading Mexico just isn't really practical because it would be political and economic suicide. Mexico is a huge country and it's directly to the south of the United States. It has a much more robust army than Cuba. It's not one that he can just take over, and the entire world would go against him and try to stop him. Also, the entire Latino voter base in the United States would be really against that, which would basically be political suicide for the Republican Party, since they need votes from people in the United States in order to actually win elections. And many people in the United States have relatives in Mexico and are from Mexican heritage, which means they would be really against this. It would be political suicide for him. On the first contention about US intervention, we've already basically shown why this isn't really going to happen. Trump is really scared of invading Mexico because it would be devastating both to the United States and to his political base. And because US intervention is more likely if we just let Trump do whatever he wants in Cuba. If Mexico resumes oil shipments to Cuba, then this actually signals to the world that there are countries that are willing to stand up against US imperialism. If the US is not just shown, if the US does not see this, they will go on and do more imperialism elsewhere, and they will be emboldened to do takeovers of other countries. Like Trump has said he wants to take over Greenland, and he said he wants to take over Panama, he said he wants to take over Gaza. All these countries in total, that's about 8 million people in total that would be subject to US imperialism if this kind of thing continues, and already the 10 million people in Cuba that Trump wants to take over by applying this pressure. He already targeted Venezuela before, like they say, and things didn't improve in Venezuela after he targeted it. He just installed a different dictatorship that was friendly to US oil sales. On the second contention they say about oil sales not being able to fix, we think we can cross-apply all the arguments we made in the first contention about electricity being necessary and about how humanitarian aid is not enough on its own, and how oil profits to Mexico actually help supply further humanitarian aid. So we believe that it's not exclusive to provide humanitarian aid and oil sales. You can do both, and oil sales actually help provide more humanitarian aid. So we believe you should vote for the affirmative team. Thank you.
Give me just 1 minute here to get my papers in order. Excuse me. There. with this, I would like to start my time in 3, 2, 1. Come on, actually, wait, let me stop time for a second. Do you want me to do a quick overview for you guys?
Sure, just order.
Okay, I'm just basically gonna go over, give a quick characterization of the round, then I'm just gonna be going over our case and the government case. With that, I will begin in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, Judge. My name is Trajan Hari, proud to present on the opposition side of this motion with the King's School. So, to start, I just want to give a really quick characterization, which I think kind of loses the government in the round. And that is that Trump is just going to block the Mexican oil. And I actually have a historical precedent for this. I remember this and I wrote this on a postcard. So, at the start of this conflict, this is from a New York Times article, Mexico, this is like when the conflict started and Trump immediately put the embargo. This is before Mexico had officially terminated their oil. There were 2 Mexican boats going to Cuba. Trump just blocked those boats and took them away, and now Mexico's having to do a whole search and rescue mission for them. Now, what does this prove to you, Judge? This proves that even if you go with the government side and say, oh, Mexico's gonna try to sell oil to Cuba, Trump's just gonna block those boats. They're not gonna get any of the benefits the government team tries to give you in this round. So every single benefit the government team gives you is going to be removed. And furthermore, this actually is a negative because this is going to embolden Trump and make him very aggressive. The government team, in the responses, is telling you that Trump is a very vindictive and aggressive person, and we agree with this. In literally the ending of their speech, they tell you how Trump wants to take over everything, that he wants to be in power. That is what motivates Trump. It's not about economic motivations, it is about that he wants to be in power. They talk about how invading Cuba would be political suicide, but Judge, invading Iran was political suicide. Like 80% of the nation is against that. So this is not going to matter for Trump. Ultimately, he's a very vindictive person, and that goes unconceded in this round, even if it goes against your political beliefs. So what does that mean with these 2 facts combined? If we allow Mexico to sell oil to Cuba, both those boats are going to be blocked, and it's going to embolden Trump to both go against Mexico and Cuba more, which is going to harm Cubans and harm Mexicans, and Trump can block the humanitarian aid. Sure.
Isn't there 0 oil going from Mexico to Cuba right now?
Going from Mexico to Cuba? Now that there's the embargo, there's no oil going to Cuba. I'm saying that in your world, if you resume trying to send oil to Cuba, it's going to be blocked. And your world will embolden Trump more and cause more negatives for the Cubans. Now that I've got that characterization out of the way, I'm just kind of going to go down the flow. In the government's case, I know they tried to start out with their contentions, but a lot of their responses in their contentions were kind of responses to our contentions, so I'm just going to start there. So, with our contentions, our first contention is this idea, hang on, here we are, about U.S. intervention being bad. And they give you a number of responses here. They say like, oh, this is like U.S. intervention on the economic side. They say like, oh, Trump is very limited with economics. He doesn't have the tariffs if possible. And they also say that sanctions are not going to target Pemex, that sanctions won't do anything to Pemex. Judge, this is simply not true, and I think it's a very terrible argument the government makes in this round. Sanctions will affect Pemex in this, because the U.S. is the world's reserve currency. The U.S. dollar is the currency of the world. U.S. sanctions are not just about selling to America. They're almost global sanctions. This is actually why when Russia invaded Ukraine, U.S. sanctions were such a big deal, because the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. U.S. sanctions are global sanctions. So it is not as if Pemex, U.S. sanctioning Pemex is only going to be selling to America. It's going to be the entire world. So when they talk about how vital Pemex is to the Mexican economy, you must flow that to the opposition side. Because their side, by incurring the wrath of the United States, by incurring sanctions and tariffs and removing the open trade deal, all of these things, aside from tariffs, go practically unrefuted in their case, especially the open trade deal. Not right now. So, Judge, no matter what, you must take their characterization that is an important factor in this round and put it on the op side. Because I remind you, even if you disagree sanctions, even if you disagree about tariffs, they did not respond to the open trade deal part, which means you must cast this to opposition. Now, on the more militaristic side of this intervention, they say, oh, Trump wants economic things, that he is only going to invade Cuba if he sees Cuba as weak. And they say that, it would be political suicide for Trump. Now, as I established, that's never stopped Trump before. Many of Trump's policies are incredibly against what the American people want. You look at any sort of polling recently, Trump is very underwater under all of his things. Personally, I mean, I live in Connecticut, which is not here, but every time I drive under a bridge, I think the last week, I've seen 14 protests underneath bridges, and all of those have been against Trump. He is unpopular. Political suicide is not a response the government can make. And then on the topic of militaristic convention, we have precedent for this. Look at what happened to Venezuela, Judge. They dropped my partner's analysis of Venezuela, which means you must flow this through. Venezuela is a prime example of a country that sold oil to Mexico. Both, you can also use this for the point I talked about earlier, because Trump took the Mexican oil boat, not Mexican, Trump took the Venezuelan oil boats. That was the whole thing, he stole their oil tankers in Venezuela. That goes to what I said earlier, but furthermore, the militaristic intervention of invading Venezuela, of trying to depose their dictator, of causing absolute chaos in Venezuela. You cannot let this point spoil their government. It is an opposition point. There will be military intervention, then it will be bad. And even if you believe it won't be a full-scale war, Trump can still do airstrikes. He can still strike Cuba, all of which will be negatives. So you don't even need to believe it'll be a full-scale war to get the negative impacts the opposition is telling you. Now, our second contention is about alternates, and they give you a lot of responses here. They say that, they say that with these, they say like, oh, if Mexico starts selling oil, it doesn't mean that Trump is gonna like stop the boats. Oh, sorry. Okay, so for the alternates, we make two big points here. We say that the oil selling is going to be worse, and we say that humanitarian aid will be useful. For the humanitarian aid points, they give you two real responses here. They say, one, you can't get the access to humanitarian aids without oil, and two, that it's a non-unique argument. On the non-unique point, it is not a non-unique argument for the reason I told you about angering Trump. If Mexico sells oil to Cuba, it's going to anger Trump and he's going to impose a full embargo on Cuba. Furthermore, by Trump striking, that's going to damage Cuba more, so it's going to not get the access of the humanitarian aid. And furthermore, the opposition world can propose a plan of furthering this humanitarian support and giving more support to Cuba. Now, on the point here about you need power for everything. Fundamentally, you're not going to be able to access the benefits of this because this is a non-unique argument. Because again, even if we try selling oil to Cuba, Trump is just going to stop those boats. You've seen this precedent even with this crisis, and you see the precedent with Venezuela. There is two direct historical precedents of this occurring. You cannot let the government swindle you on this. So ultimately, you're not going to be able to access any of the points of their idea of oil, and this fundamentally refutes, then getting into their case, their first contention about the electrical grid, right? The electric grid, you're not going to be able to access the benefits because you're not going to be getting the oil. You're not going to get the oil to be able to fund the electrical grid. And even if you do get the oil, I point you to what's happening in Iran. Trump, just recently, before the ceasefire, said he was going to strike Iranian electrical generating production, right? When Trump doesn't like a country, he's going to target the civilian infrastructure. We see this happening when he struck schools in Iran. We see this happening when he struck the electrical infrastructure. If we anger Trump by sending oil to Cuba, he's just going to strike the electrical generators, which is going to make this entire benefit not exist in this round. So ultimately, this contention is a wash because you cannot blow it to the government because you will not be able to access any of these benefits. Now, they also talk about something here, and they also kind of talk about U.S. intervention, of this idea of a slippery slope, that, we need to prove that we can go against Trump. And Judge, yes, I agree that it is a noble idea to try to go against Trump, that more countries should do that. But Mexico is not the country to do that. Mexico is not in a position to do that. Mexico should not be the country to do that. Frankly, I think the European Union should be who goes against Trump. Mexico is not the one to do that because of all of the disastrous things that will occur. Again, the government team is the one who tells you about how vital Pemex is to Mexicans' economy. And we tell you that Trump is going to destroy Pemex. He's going to sanction it, which is going to be a global sanction with the U.S. reserve currency. He's going to do tariff sanctions. He's going to remove the open trade deal, which goes conceded in this round. So no matter how you slice the cake, this is going to ruin Mexico, which is why they're not the one to stand up to Trump. You should have another country do that. Do not flow that to the government. Now, the government's second contention is about the Mexican economy. And frankly, I think this should be fully turned to the opposition side, because their only analysis is that, Pemex needs to sell oil to Cuba. But again, my partner mentioned that Pemex can sell oil anywhere else in the world. There's a global shortage. What will damage Pemex is a Trump sanction, is a U.S. sanction that will destroy Pemex and cause immense damages. So no matter how you slice the cake, the government can't access the benefits of their first contention. The opposition turns to second contentions, and both of our contentions go fully unrefuted. Therefore, you must cast a vote for the opposition. Thank you very much.
Alright, is everyone ready? Then my time will begin on my first word in 3, 2, 1. Hi, I'm Derek Shaw again, representing the King School on the opposition side of the motion. And I'd just like to summarize the debate very cleanly in this speech and make it very clear to you why you are going to be voting opposition at the end of the day. Side government fundamentally mischaracterizes the round, and that ultimately is what loses them the round. Let me explain. Side government bases all of their humanitarian impacts to Cuba on the idea that Mexican oil will actually get to Cuba. But that is simply untrue. As I mentioned in my first speech, as Ty extended in his most recent speech, when Venezuela ignored Trump and continued to send oil, he interdicted their tankers. This went conceded by the member of government. The oil from Venezuela to Cuba never actually got there. Side government agrees. In fact, they make this point that Trump hates Cuba and will do whatever he can to stop their government, to force them to submit. With that in mind, do you believe that he will allow Mexican oil through when there is already precedent of him blocking oil to Cuba, both from Venezuela and literally from Mexico themselves? No, of course he will not, okay? Trump will never allow the Mexican oil to actually get to Cuba, just as he did not allow the Venezuelan oil to get to Cuba, just as he, in fact, took the Venezuelan leader out in part because he was continuing to try to send oil to Cuba, okay? This is terminal defense to every government point that they can make on their humanitarian oil impacts. If there's no oil, you don't get any humanitarian oil impacts. If no oil ever gets there, you don't get any electricity. You don't get the people who need surgery having surgery. You don't get any of that, okay? There's no economic benefits, okay? That oil goes missing. They're trying to find it. They are losing oil. That's bad for the economy. Because of this, you can literally feel comfortable negating on presumption. This is terminal defense that, when conceded, that literally blocks every single one of their impacts, okay? Everything is like, none of the government's points stand at this point in the debate because they've conceded the fact that Trump will block oil supplies, right? Meaning that even if Mexico continues to try to send oil, none of that oil actually gets there, meaning Cuba doesn't get any of the benefits. And if we're weighing this from what is good for the world, there's no benefits to be had on the government side, then you can literally feel comfortable negating on presumption. But as it turns out, there are many opposition reasons to avoid selling oil to Cuba. For starters, the Mexican economy, and this is probably the most important thing, will be devastated, right? Both sides agree that we should support the Mexican economy. Side opposition allows Mexico to sell oil on a global marketplace free of U.S. sanctions, right? Now, side government tries to tell you, oh, well, like, the U.S. doesn't import any oil. They're like a net exporter of oil, right? So Mexico is not going to be harmed by these sanctions. But they completely ignore the fact that the dollar is the OPEC currency. They completely ignore the fact that American backing, American money, American sanctions are essential to functioning in the global oil marketplace, right? Like, to give an example of this as an extension, because I'm allowed to give examples to extend, when Iran tried to sell oil, they found that they were limited because of American sanctions, even though America wasn't directly importing oil from Iran, okay? So what will happen as a result of, like, voting for the government? As a result of,
Yeah, no, you just said you're allowed to give examples, but you can't, like, give a full new warrant for an extension in your
I'm just giving the example of how, like, Iran didn't get any benefit.
New examples.
Only new warrant, but it's up to the judge.
It's up to the judge.
It's up to the judge.
Okay, but regardless, the point stands. All right, I'll continue I have 53 seconds. I'll continue on my next word, okay? So Mexican oil industry will be completely, like, devastated as a result of voting for the government when there are no benefits to be had by voting government, okay? Next, the Mexican exports to America, for example, not just the oil imports, right? Trump will remove the free trade deals, which was conceded. He will place sanctions. He may threaten tariffs, which will hurt the economy through, like, the presumption that, oh, it's unstable, we shouldn't be investing there. We should invest in any number of other opportunities, right? The point is, Trump will do anything he can to hurt a country that he sees as trying to help Cuba. If you buy the government's own rhetoric that Trump hates Cuba so much, he will do whatever he can to change their government. Fundamentally, Trump will be violent. He will lash out. He will retaliate against Mexico. Mexico will feel all the harms. There will be no benefits to be had at the same time because Trump will continue to block Mexican oil. Voting for side government is a complete lose-lose in this debate, whereas voting for side opposition is a pragmatic choice that wins in a utilitarian net benefit world. For these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to negate. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go over maybe just some main points of clashing over these. Is everybody ready?
Yep.
Right. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. The whole negation case rests upon the assumption that Trump is basically going to take over Cuba, Mexico, and screw everyone else in the world if they actually resume oil sales to Cuba. Here's terminal defense. Russia and China have literally said that they will intervene militarily if the U.S. starts to get militarily involved with Mexico and Cuba. This is a new response to arguments out of the bloc. So we say that this is like terminal defense. The U.S. is not going to risk mutually assured destruction with countries that possess nukes for the sake of stopping 10 million people from getting like humanitarian aid and access to electricity. This is just like simply stupid. Just gut check this. This isn't gonna happen. The whole case basically rests upon like an invasion of Mexico or an invasion of Cuba in which everybody is screwed over, but always also look to our dropped warranting on our first contention subpoint B, where we tell you that Trump said he'll take it over if they don't have power because they won't have any ability to resist. He says uniquely that no power means that he'll take over, which means that in a negation world where they don't do anything.
Hello. Pause time. Sorry. On the Russia and China point, we made it very clear in our first speech on our second contention that Trump has threatened to intervene with Mexico, like shipments in the past.
The arguments of like literally blocking ships and like what was completely new out of the block. This was not in your first speech. You also like
Venezuela blocking ships and also Trump threatening. Trump said Mexico was next.
Yeah, this is also responded to by my partner out of our speeches, but it's up to the. I think this is probably like clear clash. Okay.
It's.
I'll respond in 3, 2. 2, 1. So the status quo is actually going to be an invasion of Cuba, a takeover. So let's look at this internal link of emboldening, meaning that Trump does more harm. We think we control this internal link. In the status quo, you have a guaranteed takeover of Cuba by the US, which controls this internal link to emboldenment, which means that Trump's going to go and attack a bunch of other countries, as my partner tells you, because he is now further emboldened by a takeover that's going to happen. You guarantee that in the status quo. But we tell you that, on our side, if there's literal blocking to humanitarian aid to the people of Cuba, if that happens, if the U.S. decides to do that after being quote unquote emboldened by Mexico trying to send oil back again, Russia and China is going to intervene, and they're not never going to risk all-out global nuke war here. So you see, on one side, you're getting humanitarian and getting oil.
Pio, stop your time. I know you said that the point about Russia and China, the intervening, isn't evidence, but you're using that to justify a new argument that if the U.S. tries to intervene with Mexico selling oil to Cuba, they will intervene. You're not extending it to another argument. You're making a fundamentally new argument in this case.
All of the articulation of U.S. literally taking over these countries and expanding warranting on how they're going to block ships and physically make it impossible was a direct response to the articulation that we made, and this was in your second speech. We think this is not new whatsoever. Okay. I'll resume in 3, 2, 1. So we can control this internal link. There's more U.S. imperialism and guaranteed takeover that happens in our world. Our world is the only chance of solving because it's the act that Mexico takes if it's blocked by the U.S. that's going to cause this the possibility of actual peace and humanitarian aid for people. We also say second, political suicide is a factor. They try to negate this throughout the whole round. But if Trump literally has no voter base, that literally means that he's not going to get elected and never going to further his policies because he's trying to become president a third time, whatever. And so we see that fundamentally political suicide distances literally everybody, which means that they can't do anything, especially because of how things are being blocked, extended warranting, how tariffs and everything are being blocked. Okay, on their second point of offense about sanctions, they basically said the U.S. because the U.S. is a currency that's widespread, they control literally all transactions across the world. This just fundamentally isn't true. Other countries get oil to different places. There's 2 pipelines from Russia to China where they have oil going directly there. It doesn't involve the USD at all. There's other places, as they say, there's a worldwide oil shortage. You can get it from anywhere. It's not going to be a problem. Just because the USD is common does not mean to control transactions. They can't just say any countries that use the USD is at their their beck and call. That's just not how currency works. It's money. It's not a form of stranglement. That's not how that works. Okay. We first think that you're probably weighing this round on probability. Probability comes first. We say that weighing magnitude and these possible low probability stuff, this whole basically all-out war that Trump is going to that's going to declare, leads to stuff like serial policy stasis, where you never make any decisions as everything is super low probability, which means you never take any action to help the people, because there's always a Trump of there was always a risk of Trump nuking you, which means that all the whole world collapses if you buy this perceptual link and high magnitude scare thing. We think that probability comes first. So whatever's most probable is what you're going to vote on, because it's the way that you can actually do fundamentally lifting systemic repression of peoples. We think you weigh first of all it pretty much dropped that America will take over on the subpoint B, it will take over Cuba, which means this is 100% probability, which means that this is the highest impact in the round that you weigh first, which means you look towards there. That's what you're looking at. But we also think you look at to the probability of electrical grids. We see that this is literally a 0% probability of restoring power of electricity to Cuba, which means that they again extend how there's no access to water because of electrical power grids being shut out, which means that everybody's going to die of thirst. Everybody in Cuba is going to die. It doesn't matter if Trump invades because there's literally nobody left. And so we say that we also control this probability thing because the only chance of solving is by reinstating oil, is actually by reinstating these oil sales. This is the only way you access possible life for Cubans, by giving them power that gives them access to water. This is just not responded to adequately. We think this flows through for the affirmative. You're going to restore better humanitarian condition regardless whatever our humanitarian condition is. It's better than the opposition's. They have literally zero solvency. Let me remind you, they do nothing to solve for this. Okay, they say you're probably gonna vote on presumption or whatever. We think in a world in which you think everything is probably equal, because we take some action and situations are so bad right now, we think this is a try or die for the Cubans as well. We think that's the third layer you're voting on. But again, you're collapsing on probability of the things that we articulate on both the subpoint of American imperialism and of the electrical grid. We also say they don't impact out any of their free trade stuff, so that doesn't matter in the round. They don't tell you how it affects people, so you're probably going to look at the probability impact on a magnitude of 10 million people that are going to die in a world where you don't do the AF.
Thank you. You're good.
Solid round.
Was
Would you like us to step outside?
Yeah.
Yeah.